Exhibitions and Public Programs here at the Graham Foundation. It is such a pleasure to have you all here this evening. Thank you for joining us on a Friday evening before the holiday. Really lovely to see this great turnout. And I'd like to start off by thanking Zachary Fabri for that incredible performance. So in lieu of a long intro, I am just going to welcome you all. I'm going to welcome our panelists, and we can get down to it. You've all gotten to know Zach. The composer of tonight's score, Luis Hernandez, is here. Turquoise Dyson, who is responsible for the exhibition downstairs. And so Yini Madison, who in addition to being a professor of performance studies at Northwestern University, is also partly responsible for Turquoise being her mother.
Well, I'll serve as kind of interlocutor, get you all talking to each other and having a conversation. And it's really hard to speak after such a performance as that, and to put words to that, because words can be so limiting to the kind of ephemeral beauty of the body and conversation to such a profound sculpture piece as the ones downstairs. But I do want to say, it reminded me of something that Mikhail Bakhtin said, and it may be a little bit askew in terms of what he said, exactly what he said, but it always stays with me, and that is perhaps the most painful human experience beyond torture is to cry out and there's no answer, and there's complete silence, or to ask the profound question that rattles you to your soul, and you ask it, and there's no answer, there's silence. And that notion kind of guides a lot of what I do, because it means that we are always dependent on our survival with others, that we cannot be fully human alone. And what I experienced downstairs was these pieces that Turquoise created, the labor, the intense labor that went into making such large figures, for one thing. And I'm not even talking about what they mean. I'm not even talking about the history. I'm talking about the physical labor of doing the work and the collaborative effort of others doing that work with you. And when we put our human body in the position where we're making work with others, something magical really does happen when we understand that when we're making this through a history. And this particular history for those sculptures is wrapped, we know, in terror and death and suffering, but also beauty. And I want to land on the beauty part of it, because we're not talking about beauty here as glamour. And I want to kind of pull away from those of you who know Elaine Scarry's work, and I want to land on beauty in terms of how we make beauty within the Black tradition. And that is in communication with others, in communication to those answers and those reverberations of questions that we had that re-question our own question. And that's what Zach provided for us with those beautiful sculptures. Your movement was a kind of response and answer, a conversation with those pieces downstairs. And it was beautiful because we know when we are in the presence of beauty, we have to stop and we have to pay attention, right? We know that beauty beholds us. This is part of the long tradition of how we philosophize on beauty. it begs our attention. There is no other moment but a seeing the beautiful object. I could not take my eyes off of what you were doing with those sculptures. And of course, there's an affective connection here with Turquoise and her mother. So dare anyone not say anything about it. At the same time, to have the respect and the brilliance and the virtuosity of the dancing body, to be measured about those, and the precision of those pieces. And then to bring in the breadth of that history of Henry Box Brown. And to let us know that as important and beautiful as those pieces were, when it enters the presence of the moving, breathing body, you take us back to that living, breathing history. So thank you for that. The other thing we know is that when we behold beauty, we always want to replicate it. And either we tell the story about it, we gossip about it, we write a poem about it, we dance about it, or we are in collaboration with it, as the three of you are. And particularly what we see here is a kind of replication of beauty. And I hope you will talk more about that. But the other thing, and I would like for you all to pick up on this, is that we know that when you create and repeat the beautiful, and within the Black tradition, that it is not only repeatable because we must, our musculature tells us that we must repeat it, but it is a metamorphosis. Something has changed. There is a breakage. There's some kind of intervention, or it's useless for us. It's what Toni Morrison says, it's either harangue or pornographic. So it must live on in some way for our survival. All right? So I don't want to take up too much time because I want you all to kind of talk about these things. But the significance and the importance of doing this kind of conceptual work around the history of enslavement and death and terror that can create a beautiful object to take us back there, not only in memory, but how we can reconfigure Black terror and death and humanity in this present moment by speaking through the dancing body, through the ways in which you create the kind of digital work, the collaborative work that you do. So I think it's that metamorphosis that's happening right now as we continue to talk about this work. So that's what I'm inviting you to do. And I would love to hear how you talk about this work through what does improvisation allow? How does improvisation allow the beautiful to happen in that moment that cannot be scripted? All right. And what does collaboration do in terms of the fulfillment and the manifestation of the call that always needs the other to respond? Collaboration is the remedy for that. It is abundantly important.
That was a great intro. I don't know what else to say, right? That was powerful. I'm literally stumped. No, I'm not stumped, but I feel like my back to people, so my apologies. Back to folks.
Come this way.
Yeah, I'll just kind of do some of that. That's cool. That better. Wow. Just, I think, I don't know if it's the computer or the feedback or what, but anyway, we'll figure out what's in it at some point. But just a lot of things you said resonated with me. I'm just going to hit on one part. A lot of the work I do is collaborative. Actually, just wrapped the project with two collaborators, Emmanuel Williams and Shani Crow, for the Venice Architecture Biennale, one of the curators, and I think her name, sorry, and was one of the curators for the U.S. Pavilion for an installation, Dimensions of Citizenship. And we were working on that project together as a group of three, and then having other collaborators with us. And we talked about actually that what we were making was something that none of us singularly would have ever made, but that through the collaboration makes something new. And I think that's been something I've been excited about through collaboration, is being able to kind of reverberate and bounce ideas off of people and make something completely new. It's informed by our ideas, it's informed by our ethos, or our ways of thinking about the world and our art practice, but we're actually making something completely new that's completely different than we are. And it's been exciting to, Takwase brought us into the Drawing Center project together, where I wrote first score for a performance by Zach, or interpretation of a performance by Zach. I've been writing performance scores in different ways for a number of years, actually, probably about 8 or 9 years, oftentimes word-based, and so it's sort of kind of really compact movement pieces, just a compact sentence that people perform. And then I've also been doing actually more graphic over the years. But I usually don't perform. I never really have anyone to perform with, and I'll tell people I do these things. So Takwase kind of picked up on that and invited us to be part of the Drawing Center exhibition she had in the spring. And I made a work called Underground, and we talked about that. And honestly, it was a labor of love in terms of making it. And I was just like, I didn't really like it as much as I thought I would. And then Zach and Takwase interpreted it, and then Zach performed and interpreted it, and then I was blown away. Because as a person who's writing and choreographing or writing the scores, I'm maybe less interested in how sort of tight it is to that format of it, but I really wanted to allow the interpreting to happen, right? So I made these things Zach interpreted and create something new. And so I was really blown away by, I wasn't actually physically present when he did the performance, but seeing the documentation, I was blown away by how he moves his body, how he puts his body into architectural spaces. I was citing his body in very particular places that were reminiscent of these sort of non-spaces or liminal spaces that African Americans and now people across the globe have found themselves sort of moving into for survival. And so thinking about how to sort of place his body into those spaces and what might it mean to move, live, the residue and smudge in your body against those spaces, right? You saw that on the performance downstairs and the hole we'll talk about later. So I was blown away by that. So when Takwase asked us to be part of this, I was like, I really want to bring the body back into the work. And so, and I'll pretty quick just end right here to kind of continue the conversation, but I was really interested in how Takwase makes her work. It's like you said, like the hand is there, and then the hand sometimes isn't there in the sense of maybe a perception of it, right? And so seeing the work on the first floor where we started, it's both sort of conversation with minimalist architecture and art, right? It's a conversation, this history of Henry Black Brown. It's a conversation around a lot of things. And for me, I didn't want people to miss, I'm glad you said this earlier as part of our conversation, I didn't want people to miss Henry Brown in the box and what it might mean to mail yourself. And it's quite a feat to be mailed in 1849 and arrive somewhere else 27 hours later alive. Right? We barely get packages from Amazon with that, right? So we're talking about, there was no U.S. postal system, as I understand it, in 1849. And so the fact that he was mailed himself express mail from Richmond to Philadelphia is quite a feat, right? And so thinking about all of those different stops that he made from the store that he was in with the box to the wagon to the steamer, right, to the, like he had about 7 different stops where he was taken off, flipped over, almost died or felt like he was dying, his body being turned over, blood rushing to his head. And then constantly being, as he writes in his own narrative, being saved by God, right? So someone comes over and says, hey, I need somewhere to sit, and the box flips over and he's able to kind of regain himself. And so thinking about all that jostling and what it might mean to kind of be in the space that's in, so basically he's wrapped in burlap in the actual wooden box, but just thinking about his tussling and tumbling, and I knew that this would be an amazing piece for Zach to interpret. So I'll just stop right there because I know I talked up too much already, but just to help set it up, I guess. I'm sorry. The second part is I don't want to forget Anthony Burns.
Right.
So the second floor was actually in honor of Anthony Burns, who also escaped from slavery. And so he basically, different stories. He basically escaped by escaping on a ship to Boston. So both of these men actually left from Richmond, Virginia, and ended up in the North, right? And so he goes on a ship, gets to Boston. He's there in February of 1854. This is right after the Fugitive Slave Act, 1850. And by May, he's actually put back on the ship and returned to his owner. And then eventually he's bought and he's freed again right after that. And so again, for the second floor, we talked a lot about this idea of, in response to Torquato City's other installation on the second floor, the mass of fiber and these hyper shapes that are on the ground, the wooden shapes that are on the ground, thinking about that as like waves in the wake, right? The sort of thinking about the sea, thinking about a kind of a liquid terrain, so to speak, constantly shifting terrain, and what that might mean for Anthony Burns to be on the ship, sort of moving through, thinking about all the bodies that were transported through the sea, thinking about people who escaped by water, thinking about people who had to work in water, right? All these sort of things, and to think about that, and again, to kind of write a score, prepare a score for Zach to interpret as it relates to Anthony Burns. So I just wanted to thank him for, seeing the body and seeing his body back in those pieces, and for Torquato to open that conversation up for us to interpret as it relates to her own work. Job is done, it's done, right? I mean, we both said our pieces.
I guess I want to ask this question. For folks who don't know those stories and don't know that that work was inspired by those histories, and all they see are these big, large black triangles and string on the ground. That's all they see, but they don't know the referent for it. So when you talk about this work coming very specifically from that history, and you performing the affect of that history, I guess my question is for conceptual artists, why do you choose that form? What is it about? And I know you're asked this all the time about figures, because I said, well, Torquato, when she was still started doing this work, I said, but I don't know can't you put a little face there, or a hand, or a tree, or something that I can recognize? And she said, Mother, you don't ever have to worry about that. There will never be a figure in anything I do. So I just had to be cool and say, okay, let me learn this. And I am, I guess I'm not supposed to say this, sorry. But, yes, it really is. But so why choose to do abstraction, conceptual art, minimalist abstraction, rather than, because I know you can, what did they say, draw. I know you can make figures and have the boat and people can recognize it and say, oh, that's what it is. And that's beautiful work too, and we both appreciate that. But why do you choose this form in this way? And if you don't know, that's okay.
You know I know.
She definitely knows.
Because
I
I
know.
don't do stuff I don't know why I do it. I just do it.
Well, I'll back up a bit and say abstraction is a breadth of things. So you can make figuration, and figuration can very much be in the language of abstraction, right? So abstraction to me is a tool that you put in place when you're trying to articulate something that distances you from a thing that you can control, right? So it's a way of distancing yourself from what you think you cognitively know. And the act of distancing yourself makes a space or hole, right, for questioning. And then abstraction allows you to sort of slowly fill in that hole as you see fit. But the fill-ins or the things that get put in that hole are then lenses to make you see that original thing more clearly and more broadly, right? So abstraction is a way to say, here's this original narrative, whether it's figuration or something geometrically bound to non-figuration. The way in which abstraction provides these lenses to see the original information clearer is up to the artist. So to answer your question about that particular work downstairs is that the reason I'm distancing myself with the shape or shape language is because the narrative I know about Box Brown has been through not only a sort of white lens or a lens of that presumes that the narrative can tell the whole story.
Gotcha.
And, narrative is oftentimes a useful tool, but oftentimes inadequate under the lens of white supremacy. So using abstraction to distance myself to what I know about those stories, and then in that hole that I make in that distance, replacing them with questions, right, about tumbling and negative space and positive space and atmosphere. Mm-hmm. So when I was taught Box Brown and I think about Box Brown work, I see the box. I say, okay, that's a box. And I say, that's a man in a box. And I say, that's a man enslaved and is talking about liberation in a box. But abstraction then talks to me and allows me not as a way to communicate to other people, but a way to get at that that's a man, but he's also a magician, right? He's also an acrobat. He's also a man of endurance. He's also a man of acute planning. He's also a man of engineering in relationship to other black men who were engineers. So the work is about me sort of distancing myself from narratives that sort of take over my belief in blackness, which is, a thing that has to always be redone under white supremacy, but then hold that space and then replace it with things that get me closer to individual humanity. And I'll just say when Zach was downstairs and working around not only Box Brown, but Harriet Jacobs and Anthony Burns, this idea of how do we, as black bodies, providing systemic orders of self or liberation, right? That means the material, that means the space, that means the travel, that means the boats, that means the communication, that means the letters, that means the text on the box. So that's just not a system of liberation, that's a systemic order of liberatory steps. So when I think about form, I think about those questions. And I'm desperately, in a public way, trying to get at those questions. So I'm not interested in legibility, because black narrative is to a great extent is illegible just because of the way we got here, right? That death space is oftentimes illegible in the hands of someone else's control over narrative. So that's why I'm trying to get at something that's closer to a sort of cognitive comprehension of what it means to survive in these conditions and what it means to have a sort of acute genius to operating in these systems, right? Because the idea is that the human brain has the capacity to operate in different systems simultaneously, overlapping and taking up the same space at the same time. And that's a particular condition under people that are trying to be oppressed by someone else, and the oppression is not winning, right? So these are accomplished stories, these are survival stories where I'm trying to get at the engineer, I'm trying to get at the magician, I'm trying to get at so I'm making these shapes and I'm making this work to think about negative space, to think about tension, pulling, distance, so that I can recognize that the narrative is inadequate and I can replace it with other questions that are closer to this genius. And I'm not interested in legibility in that way, or public or audience legibility. I'm interested in asking different questions. So I hope that
about your experience in this collaborative work with these two folks and how that generated some of what you did
Sure.
in the space?
Sure. Yeah. I feel like this is a very healthy thing for me on so many levels. Healthy for my practice, for me as a person. It's just good for me that I'm not alone, like on the computer alone all the time. That I can, that I can communicate with like-minded, brilliant people, and for my practice as well, I feel like it opens things up in a very good way. But I think about ego a lot. I think about working with people and working with groups, and I'm pretty good about understanding and navigating different egos in the room and with friends and colleagues and these things. But I usually have this resistance to collaboration. And I've tried it before and I just didn't like it. I'm a control freak. I really like to control. I really like structure, and I like my structure. I like. Yeah. No. And it's really my opposition to collaboration previously. Let's say, has been about like this. It's really like I just want my ideas. It's just like my ideas. That's it. So there's something beautiful and interesting and. There's something where you get stuck and you're only dealing with your own practice and your ideas and your history and the way that you kind of conceive the world, and there's a growth that happens when you're challenged, as a person. When you're challenged to kind of make new things, yeah. In short, that's been like just good. But in terms of let's say developing movement with my body, I feel like it's just been a new thing, and I was really interested when you asked me to kind of respond to your physical objects on a few times. And it's something very different from my practice, which is freeing and it's opening, and I can really step back, and it could be something that's totally new. But what we're doing right now, this kind of three-pronged, it's something. It works in a way where. I don't know. It's like, I do know it works because you make very good work, and I'm in this because I'm attracted to the way that you think and what you produce, right? Andres is brilliant in how he can synthesize and distill and handle so much information, right? And then kind of hand off this treatment or the score, and you're like, there you go, buddy. Good luck. But in terms of improvisation and structure, I like that challenge where I'm like, okay, this is someone else's structure. These are someone else's ideas that I have to kind of honor and not honor at the same time. So I like that challenge of I guess it's also kind of dealing with ego and the how that relates to making, and it's nice to work on something to think about something that what I'm kind of ultimately going for honors the larger project. It honors the work that you made that influences your score. And I'm also really interested in the little takeaways along this process, and also the being able to remove things too along the way.
Did you have questions for each other, or shall we now open it up to the audience? Yeah.
Paul, please go ahead. If anyone had a question. Sorry.
First of all, I was waiting on this. First of all, thank you. I think it's just wonderful and generous, beautiful work. I'm a major fan of all three of you. But I wanted to ask Turquoise specifically about the reference to slavery and the criticism that you are so far removed from it as a woman in 2018. And you talked about some space between that abstraction creates. And I wanted to know what sort of resonant aspects of the Box Brown pass through contemporaneous conditions that make it timely or necessary for you.
Yeah, climate change. So I understand to be true that we are facing a condition of movement pretty readily, and fugitivity, and conditions of fleeing, and trying to think about these histories of self-liberation and discipline and planning and strategy as a way to get at solutions and kind of strategies when the waters rise and the imperialists and the white supremacists begin to cage, have begun to cage, when the heat and atmospheric pressure is a slow violence, in the sense that semi-deserts are becoming actual deserts because of the heat index of the planet. And sort of traditional African nomadic architectural practices need to be thought through again. So, as an African American woman whose sort of genealogy comes from New Orleans and Florida, I understand that in some way my people were maritime people and were moving inland, and from New Orleans coming to Chicago. So this transversing geographies and the technologies and I'll say the engineering confidence of the black body to self-emancipate through materials that are ready for us to use towards that end. I think about the history of enslaved and how they perform these things. I think that they're templates for not only cartography, but to deal with what I think Zach dealt with very well, the terms of breath and the body and the immediacy. And I'll say that specifically as we're making work, and I think about these histories and thinking about the way in which I think we so desperately need to understand these narratives anew, right? Understand these histories anew. Both Box Brown and Harriet Jacobs drilled, made holes, these circular holes in their places of self-organized containment, right? And I think about the Indian Ocean, and I think about contemporary slave trade, and I think about black bodies being placed back in the hulls and drowned in death ships, right? So I think about ways in which peoples who are both have a history of being in the hold and captured, and in the hold and liberation, and then now histories of people being in the hold because of, not only global economic exchange, but environmental terror and atmospheric terror. I'm looking for these examples, as I think that this, they can teach us something about how both people activate autonomously in systems of oppression, and how those autonomous acts relate to how one has breath. So when Zachary was on the floor, breathing through the architecture, right, and making that sound, that is not only visceral, but it's true, right? The way in which, how we relate to each other, Andre's very much hands off to Zach. And Zach then not only interprets, but makes an amalgamation, but also creates a whole new experience of how I think about breath in this building, right, in the history of this building. So in my mind, that both improvisational knowing that Zach put on his own body to say, I'm gonna breathe through this hole, and I'm not gonna breathe while I move, but I'm gonna breathe where there are holes, right? Talks about time, talks about lung capacity, talks about distance, talks about understanding what the body can do. As he said, reach your arms high. Now think about it and reach them higher, right? So that's where I think as we adjust to geographic shifts, operations of climate change, these histories around what we'll have to do with our body are built-in stories of self-liberation. And like I said, I make this work so I can make that a subject.
That's mind blown, right? That's a great question, I think, and I always think about this idea of like our distance from it. Even like Harriet Jacobs is like in her narrative, right? Same thing with Box Brown, like they're writing almost apologetically, like you can't possibly understand exactly what happened, so I'm not really actually going to write it, but I can't actually detail it. So we're removed from that piece, but honestly, I feel like we're never removed from the residue of all of it, right? Particularly around spatial oppression, as it relates to lots of types of bodies. We're talking specifically about Black bodies, and what that has meant in terms of surveillance, what that has meant in terms of actually freeing yourself by containing yourself, whether it's Brer Rabbit in the briar patch, right? You get thrown back into the thing that's the dangerous thing for everyone else, but Brer Rabbit is able to navigate that space, right? So he confines himself to the thing that's the bad thing to everyone else, but it's the good thing that gives him sustenance in life. So I think about, just how I had a workshop earlier today, or a conversation, and thinking about how young people's bodies are policed, and particularly, and not even in thinking about it from sort of state violence and state policing, but thinking about it as the average everyday citizen. And we talked about how young people actually don't have places to go because they're constantly being told they can't be places. So you can't go to the public library anymore unless you're with an adult. You can't go to the corner store to get something to eat because we can't have more than 2 18-year-olds in the same space. You can't go to the park district because unless you're actually registered for a class and you're over 13, they don't want you in the park, actually inside the building, right? So all these places become non-places and spaces for them. But then we ask these questions, well, why don't young people have anything to do or anywhere to go, right? And so thinking about even that piece, right? There's this oppression in that sense, and particularly that's related to Black and brown bodies, queer bodies, right? Think about all the different folks that are impacted by the ways we regulate space, right? And injustices around space. And so that's a lot of the residue, I think, that we're never quite removed from. It's the traces of that legacy. And that's not even talking about economics and everything else. That's a whole different conversation. But just that alone in terms of space is something that's never left. And, I think, and we feel it in our bodies. I felt it 6 times walking from Millennium Park Garage to my office building on Monroe and Wabash, when I had to contort my body as a 6 foot, 200-pound man around people who were decidedly going to walk into me, right? Because I'm almost not there. because I really aren't there because they don't see me anymore, right? And so I think about all of those moments where I'm constantly doing Zach on a very smaller scale, right? You know, just like when I get into the elevator, when I, you know, whatever, like all these things that I'm doing to kind of compact, contort, contain myself to be less threatening, but also to be actually protective of myself in other environments. So like those things are like huge in our bodies, in our minds, and the way we relate to each other. So I just wanted to put that out there because that was a great question. I just wanted to add to talk from a different perspective.
That's beautiful.
Sorry, we got too heavy. I'm sorry, you know, we just lighten it up.
Can I ask one very technical question? With the score tonight, I'm curious what it was that you communicated to Zach. What was he working on?
I was like, Zach, go for it, man. You got this, right? Well, I have them both on the screen. Yeah. I'll talk through it. I have both on the screen. We'll go back to, we actually used this in the workshop earlier today, so this particular work, particular part of the journeyman score, I always have to, I do throw a lot of information at them, and so the name of this work is Journeyman, and it speaks to a lot of histories, right? They both made journeys, from slavery to freedom, back to slavery and back into freedom again. But also just thinking about too the roles of the project in Venice, we were looking at more enslaved women, and I spent a year thinking about that and reading about the experience of women, which is much different than enslaved men, right? In terms of spatial experience too. So I was thinking about journeymen too, in the sense that these are men that could actually hire themselves out for work elsewhere, right? They were allowed where women wouldn't necessarily be able to do that because they had a different sort of geography and cartography of plantation landscapes in the larger South. And actually, in fact, Anthony Burns Henry Brown sort of uses that as a foil, right? To say that he's sort of going like, I have other work, but I got injured in that work, can't do it, and that becomes the way that he finds a way to escape. He has an excuse to not be somewhere else in order to kind of plan out his escape, right? So also thinking about that idea that the freedom of movement of men, African-American men, which is much different than, in my head, I'm thinking about this other project in Venice and Black women, but putting it here. So that's Journeyman is the kind of larger scope. And then in terms of the scores, I actually, I had a whole different idea about this project. And then one day I was like, well, Takwasi already did all the scores because they're on the second floor, beautiful wall, 210 drawings called Tuning. And I was like, I don't need to make anything, right? Those are really beautiful and they could be interpreted. I could have said, hey, Zach, take 17, 22, whatever, and then make something happen. But I also wanted to think about how not only Torquase is putting her body into the making of those works, right? So not just the wrist, I keep talking about this, but not just the wrist, the elbow, the shoulder, her body in terms of making these moves, but also thinking about how I might potentially mimic those moves and making new drawings. There's an image, it's a source image. Oh, that's a bingo long, sorry. Don't worry about those. The source image that I was using, which is David Hammond's in his studio in LA at the time, this is an image of him making a body print. And so he's actually, it's not Vaseline, I can't remember what he's using, but he's that and pigment actually in his body, and then pressing his body into paper to make these really amazing prints, very controlled. That image is, I actually had years ago saw like an undergrad, 20-something, 25-something years ago, whatever, seen the prints, but had never really seen the image of Hammond's making the prints. And the body is there, the body is fully in it, but you don't necessarily see the action. And so you think about the kind of classic Jackson Pollock painting, photograph was Newton, who's showing Pollock, tossing the paint on a larger, this is like that mood. And I was thinking of Hammond's body as a sort of foil to that, right? To that kind of that one motion of an action painting, and here's another sort of action painting and printing, right, using the body. I was also just thinking, like, I actually started looking for images from the Watts riots. I couldn't find the one image I wanted, but I was also thinking about the body pressed against the built environment. Right, so the body pressed against the sidewalk forcibly through state violence. The body pressed against the side of a building forcibly through state violence, right? The body sort of being contorted and pressed inside of tenement housing, right? Not having actual space to actually live. And so thinking about those bodies being pressed against something as sort of the start of the conversation around this particular score, or both scores actually. So I used this image of Hammond's. So I know you said it more beautifully than I will ever say it, but I'm using this image of Hammond's in action, leaving an imprint of his body on this piece of paper, and I take that image and actually remix it through my body. You kind of saw it in the other, you saw it on the screen before, like this sort of wave. I'm taking that, and I just wanted to do this very, the first score I did was very controlled, very tight, very like architectural. I have an architecture background. And so it was like, I'm out with my, my rulers, and I thought it was interesting, work, right? And I think seeing Zach, Zach perform it, like, opened it up, right? And then I was like, I actually want to be the performer, but not actually you see me. And so what I did was I used this image of Hammond's, that's just a printout, and I basically made the moves on a photocopier machine to get unique images every time. So I probably made about 150 or so unique images using an image of Hammond's. And so, has everyone here made a photocopy before? Okay, some people haven't, right? They're like, I've never made, because they give it to someone else to do, right? This is the reality of power, right, in this world. But no, so it's like you press the button, it kind of goes, and then it's like, shoot, like that, right? We all kind of know the procedure. And so it's very fast. It's probably not a second. I said a second earlier. It's probably like a second and a half. And so something that's kind of moving like that to create an image, I have to kind of get into a rhythm with an image to sort of like pass it through, right? To get that sort of, that flow. Looks like cornrows or water or waves or sound wave, right? And then I'm also then saying, well, I don't just want this. I'm not trying to replicate Hammond's, which I think is getting back to making something new. I'm not trying to replicate an image of Hammond's making an image in this work. I want to actually evoke the sort of energy, spirit of the body from Taquase's own work, the body of Anthony Burns, who said he fell asleep on the ship, and imagine what that journey is like to sort of be rocking, and you saw Zach's body interpret that, what it might mean to sort of be a wave, and then act that out actually on the copier to make these unique prints. I'm less invested in those being, I like the quickness of it and the ease of it and the cheapness of it. So it's just on regular paper. Like, everybody in this room can do that. In fact, you all should do it, because it's liberating, right? And we should just bring a copier in, everybody that's our next workshop. Let's just do this, right? But there's, there's a tendency to sort of fix it. And I thought, what was interesting is that this is something that's completely unique. It's on cheap paper. It's like we used them earlier, we tore them up, folded, they were all types of things, and that became the sort of source material. The second one was similarly thinking about, you kind of could see it in here, but you see Hammond's foot, and foot, and foot, and foot, and foot, and it creates a rhythm, right? So I was thinking about a dial, sort of time. There are 7 sort of kind of black areas that represent the 7 stops that he made, but they're not all equally timed. And thinking about this sort of repetition and stuttering and staggering of his foot and his body. And so I basically just sat with Taquase and Zach and said, here they are. And I talked about some of the ideas. I had walked into the first floor gallery probably like 15 times. And then I just saw like 3 holes in the floor. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I asked Sarah, the director, I said, well, what was here? And kind of explained it was, kind of a remnant from a previous, not installation, but previous construction, configuration of that floor. And I kind of looked down in it, and I was like, what's down there? And she said it was just storage space. and there's a light there, so you can kind of see it. But it struck me that it's one of like maybe 3 holes in there that aren't plugged. So everything else is plugged up, and I was like, why would someone leave a hole in there? And I was like, that's the project right there, because it represents the 3. You know, in my mind, just being real simple. It represents those 3 holes that were bored by Henry Brown with a gimlet to actually use to breathe. And so I actually didn't say, hey, Zach, you should breathe into the hole. I was like, y'all saw that tonight for the first time? I did too. I was like,
Right.
I was gone. I'm done. I was like, we're done for the night, you know. You know, and so I think the fact that it's kind of tight in the sense that I do the research and kind of make these things, but it's still open enough where I'm not like mad that Zach breathed into the hole, or that he breathed into 2 holes in the floor, right? I'm like, damn, it was about these 3, right? I let go, right? Because it's like, it's more important to see how he interprets the work, so, yeah.
Ellen, I'm so glad that you asked that question, because that gives all of us a glimpse into this process. You know, we witnessed your dancing, but we did not know, you know, about the image that you saw, and then you put it through the copy machine, and your labor in terms of, and creativity in terms of making this as part of a collaborative process that invoked much of what Zach did in terms of the improvisational work that he did. So I think that these conversations are important because we get a clue into your method. You know, we get a clue into the process. And I think knowing something about that process helps us understand what we see as a result of that process. The kind of narrative behind it. So if there is a moment that we can rescue the narrative, it's abandoning the master narrative to embrace the micro narrative that comes out of these very particular projects that you do, that then gives us a context for what we see.
First, thank all of you all. Thank you for producing the work that you've produced tonight. It's been a phenomenal night, witnessing the performance, his expression of your choreography, and obviously the inspired work that kicked it all off. These conversations are very illuminating in that it gives us as the viewer an opportunity to better understand what it is that informed the work. And I don't want to be too basic, but I'll take the rare opportunity to ask if you guys as the creators can give us as the viewers some idea of how we might access the work. As you've been describing over the last half hour or so, there's clearly a lot of intentionality that goes into producing the work, and being somewhat familiar with your bodies of work coming tonight, I've been able to read it a little bit better than maybe folks that see it for the first time. But for those of us that do see it for the first time and don't know who Henry Brown is, or Harriet Jacobs and so forth, as we just get immersed in the moment, can you give us some sense of how it is that we might interpret a bit of what it is that infused the work to begin with? How should we view the work, seeing it for the first time, not knowing all that informed it?
Yeah, it's so interesting because as a performance person, it's almost like you have the playwright, you have the actor, and you have the dramaturg. You know, I mean, that's kind of the way we think in theater, right? So the dramaturg, the play is created through the playwright. And then the dramaturg gives us the history, the context, the information we need to understand the play. And then the actor performs it, which both of you serve. So I think we all need some dramaturgy sometimes to help us along the way.
That's great.
Well, I'll just say this.
Into the mic? You said it should move closer to the mic, too.
It's not what I tell you.
What is it?
No, nothing.
You see? I think that that's a difficult question, really, it is. And some of that meaning in these sort of conceptual frameworks, that they're completely opaque, right? You don't have access, and you won't, unless you come to like a conversation like this, or you pick up the text, or you dive a little deeper, right? It's just a kind of opaque condition. So what I tried to do is I tried to appeal to the senses. I try to make things that inspire or get you to stay for the conversation. I try to make things that, and I don't make them alone, right? I try to make things and pull people into the conversation that can think with me about this question of access and legibility and audienceship and participatory acts of thinking and perceiving. So with this kind of application or practice as an art maker, yeah, one of my realities is that there is a boundary, like there's built-in boundaries in the thing, and I'm trying to make it so those built-in boundaries, the audience sort of leaps over them based on looking at the object. So I'm very aware that with the tuning project, that I need to make 210 of them. I need to fill the wall because I'm begging for your attention, right? I'm begging for your investment, you know? I'm not begging for your recognition or your understanding, you know? I'm actually sort of begging for your questions. So, because I have them, right? And I'm as I make exhibition, I try to use material and art objects so that the questions, but the objects become acutely aware of both surface and material and distance. And it was funny that I think we were talking, Derek, and you were like, you got spatial, right? And you know my work. It took me a long time to get spatial. And that kind of spatial leap, people understand over time, and you understand, I think you have a couple of my pieces, that are just, I just ask for the conversation. So I don't know other than, you know, kind of begging or desperate investment in us all too. And I try to make forms that, with my body and with composition, like I'll say this, sort of my Coltrane call, I'll call it a Coltrane call, right? I'll try a Coltrane call, and I'm trying to exhaust the possibilities of the tools in front of me, right? And I'm trying to exhaust them in front of you, right? And I'm trying to exhaust them in a way that pulls you in to say, what is that? So I don't take for granted your senses, right? But I don't presume, or I don't play to an expectation of the recognition or something recognizable. I'm totally trying to reach out to sensoria in a kind of visual experience. And I'm trying my best to do that. So some of it is opaque, and I'm asking for your time and consideration. And I try to work hard for it.
I mean, I'm an art educator, so we're all educators.
That's true.
And we're artists.
And then there's that.
Literally everyone up here is an educator, and I'm pacifically, as they say, I'm pacifically an art educator. Y'all don't listen to me. Is this being recorded? It's not being recorded, is it? Is this going to be on the website? Oh no, I said pacifically. Anyway, but I'm thinking a lot about that with my students, particularly grad students, thinking about interpretation. Right? And so, you know, how does one enter into the work? But I'm also, as an educator, I'm interested in the constructivist view, right? That we all bring something to this work, and it's not about me feeding that to you. We can give you the writing. We can have all their books in the library, their books for sale, their books in the library downstairs. The only thing we don't have is, there's wall labels, but there's print materials that describe the project. There's the website. There's like all these things. There's workshops. There's these talks. There's the films. All the things become ways to sort of enter into the work in one way. And I think there's also, as an art educator and as someone interested in that constructed experience, is that, it's how do we bring these things out of people, right? So, we all understand what it means to breathe. We may not necessarily be mindful of it, but we understand breathing. And we also know, what it feels like to have trouble breathing, right? Or, we're still here. Some people may have come back, but maybe stopped breathing completely, right? And I think seeing your work, it's like you didn't have to know about David Hammond. You actually didn't even have to know about Box Brown, but there was something that you could relate to in that moment. And also, we talked about this yesterday, like, even movements. So I was thinking a lot about just this one writer, Douglas Kearney, who I really love, the poet, but he wrote a piece that's looking at these movements, shake, shimmy, shuffle, stutter, and stagger. And then Zach added skank, right? And I was like thinking about still. It's like these are things that he was thinking about those as both protective as well as weapons, right? African Americans being able to kind of use these movements and embody these movements as a way to both protect themselves, but also as a weapon to kind of keep people at bay, right? And we didn't talk about that really. We just kind of talked about it at a sidebar. It wasn't really part of the score. Necessarily, but it was in my head and thinking about the score, but I didn't necessarily say that to Zach. But I think those are things that we know. We talked about swagger, right? Like how people walk and sit, and everyone talked about Obama and Trump, the photograph of their first meeting, and like, Obama's like, he got this like swag about him, right? And then everyone's like, Trump's so scared. And I love that image because regardless of Trump, it was like this idea that a black man, sits a certain way, and a black man in power sits even a different type of way. Those are things that we relate to, right? That we all can relate to. Or earlier in the conversation, in my conversation earlier today, there was someone that brought this statistic about women and men navigating space differently. And I was like, well, I don't know the research about that, but I was like, my question is, why would women navigate space differently than men, right? Like, instead of talking about the science of it, let's ask the question, what are the cultural, environmental factors that women have to work around to create a new navigation and geography of space, right? And we know that because there are folks in the room who navigate space differently than I would, right? And there are folks who look like me that navigate space even differently than I would as well. And so we embody that, we know that. It's just how do we sort of bring that out through the work? And I think experiencing the work and bringing that back to what am I seeing in front of me? What questions is this asking of me? Even if it's really dense and opaque, how can I enter into this work in some way that I think is a way for me to connect to it? Even if I'm quote unquote wrong, it's like that's the way to kind of engage in the dialogue. And I think that's hopefully what these sort of interpretive devices do.
And I'm interested in the conversation between like opacity and transparency, right? I'm interested in that tension. So some of it is also about this idea of some things I don't want to say, right? Some things I want to refuse, and some things I want to invite. So this metaphor between like negative and positive space, what we say, or what we are asked to say, what we are asked to prove, what we are asked to image, or what we are asked to communicate about our own selves, right? Share with us your blackness. Share with us your African American experience, So I'm interested in the tension between what does it mean to say a truth about that experience, right? And that truth still be opaque, right? The velocity of, and I was looking at one of Derek's paintings, I think somewhere, where he has these, he's interested in sport, but this one piece where the band and all the men are like leaning back. I went to an HBCU. And that image rattles me. Like I'm stuck in the gravity of that bed. I'm stuck in it. And everybody might not get it. Everybody don't have to. So, but I know that there's texture, there's color that invites these things in, right? So I'm interested in that kind of, and the first time I saw Zach perform, I think you were performing on Neri's piece. Yeah. And it was a moment of subjectivity. It's about your family and about breathing and space and running. That performance, that particular performance. I've only known Zach maybe about a year and a half, maybe.
I didn't even know that.
2. Yeah, we're new, maybe 2 years. But I was watching him perform, and I've never worked with any performers before Zach, and not after. But I knew when I said, "I will make this sculpture, can you come activate it?" I knew it was going to have that deep interiority, that moment of improvisation. I never talked to him about what he's going to do. I'm not interested in talking to him about what he's going to do. I just have an ethos of trust and I don't know. It's just being, like being and belonging in his own body. I can just sense it. And I know that I don't have access to all of the subjectivity that he brings to it. So I feel like we're kin, and that he's asking me to experience what it is his ethos is sending out, and he's asking in the live moment, like he's asking in real time, and I envy that. Like I envy that. I want my drawings, even though they're static, two-dimensional, and I still want them to be online, as, sorry, I can't remember his name right now, but the black body online. Like I want that. Whether I can understand what it is or not, I feel that. So sometimes it's heavy and opaque, and sometimes it's transparent, but there's definitely tension and a suspension, a precariousness that's operating in the way we make, and why we make. Not to be digested, but that we can join each other in the sort of desperate way we're trying to make meaning.
One more second, say, one of the things that is really interesting me in this conversation is, Torkwase, you were talking about, you became spatialized in this exhibition, which is a significant change from the last iteration of this project in March at the Drawing Center. And I had the opportunity of sitting next to you when you're thinking through these sculptures, and you were thinking about Zach engaging with them from the beginning. It was not an afterthought. It was you had this performance in your mind from before they became a thing, and it was what you were thinking about when we sighted them, when they were installed. So I think this is a sort of unique and very interesting collaboration that was fully a part of the entire process. And I wanted to ask you, Zach, you've now gone through, this is your second performance with this body of work. The body of work at the Graham is different than at the Drawing Center. There's some objects that are the same, some are different. And you also have two sort of very different scores. Yeah. The first score was very much more sort of architectural, diagrammatic. This is much different from that one as well. What is your experience with similar subject matter but totally different stagings?
It's a good question. I think it's this context and I guess the physical architectural context of everything. So the Drawing Center presented rules that Andres kind of scripted out for me to kind of follow or not follow. But I always feel like when you make your work, you make your work. in relationship to bodies and heights and to your own body and to other bodies. So whether it's mine that you have in mind further down the road or an imagined viewer or person. But in terms of the difference between these two sites and my performances in them. So the first one was Closed Door, right? And I think we were talking about it, and I was like, well, I'm not interested in performing for people for the first one. And that's just kind of how I felt. And right, and it was not an invited audience. I think there was just camera people and maybe a few staff. And so then it became, we shifted that to the camera and me kind of engaging in space, responding to a score, responding to your work, the architecture of the Drawing Center, the stairwell in particular. So.
I'm trying to pull up the video, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, that was just a kind of completely different way of, like, for me, being in the space, because there was this, like, there's a camera, I'm going to do something, we're going to start and stop and start and stop. But in this space, I've had to contend with, like, live audience and people watching in real time. And so my practice navigates video and edited video and also, like, a real-time experience. And so I try to play with that and with the start of the performance, whether you see me start and how it ends, if you understand where it starts and if you understand where it ends. So that's important for me, like the liveness and how an audience engages in space. So, for example, I was talking to Andres about the kind of how performances can be a static thing, where there's a static audience and a performer on a stage. It's very binary, it's very separate, and the audience is very stationary. And I've done multiple performances where I try to complicate that. And this one was 2 floors, so obviously people kind of followed me upstairs. There was a queue, and they kind of understood that the performance was going to continue upstairs. But I went into that back room with more the, I forgot the name of those works, that in that room with the cord.
Oh, yeah, I've heard, I don't know.
Yeah. So that was just like a holding space for people to kind of come up the stairs and for me to catch my breath. And that was just like a casual behind the curtains. You're watching me walk around, catch my breath. You're there. You're thinking he's going to perform here, but I'm also thinking that no, I'm going to make you move again to this other space where Andres was like, I'm interested in this work, and that was like, so it was like kind of me working with the audience and the architecture of the space, making you move, waiting for you, you waiting for me. So there's not a lot of tools to play with, a lot of toys in each context. And I generally dislike the audience. That's a whole other conversation.
I love it.
It's so true.
Yeah.
So true.
Yeah. No, I mean, you guys are great. I love you guys are great. But generally speaking, I don't like the audience. So I usually perform in opposition to the eyes that are consuming my body, perform for you. And the root of my work was it was never about performance. It was trying to can I try to critique and unpack and fuck around with the consumption of Black performance. And I was trying to subvert that, and I learned over the way through many different works that you can't ever. So I was like, well, let me try to own that and play with that as material. The fact that, and I go back and forth with performing, not performing, announcing to the world that I've retired, not answering emails and then answering this other email and getting in trouble. But all of it, it's research, it's investigation into these things that I haven't figured out yet. So I feel like I'm still doing it because I haven't figured out how not to do it, and also why am I doing it. And so it's like these spaces that we find ourselves in.
I'll just say one thing I loved about tonight that I keep thinking about that. I actually didn't. Sometimes I pay attention to titles of work. Sometimes I don't. And even though I had seen the work at Drawing Center and seen the series, I didn't realize the series was called Tuning. The drawing. Well, but it is now, right?
Yeah,
it's called Tuning. But
I just make up.
what's wrong with that?
Just happened.
Right,
Yeah,
just,
this happened.
it's out in the world, it's in the ether now.
Along
so.
the way.
But there was a moment tonight where when we started, well, the performance started, and Zach was tuning to me, and I thought that was really interesting. Right, he was trying to understand that space in the way that he knew that what he wanted to do, he had the access, the room, the space, even thinking about audience to make that work happen. And it was just exciting to see, you know, it's like, it reminded me of like, you know, you go to the orchestra and it's like people are like, you know, trying to tune the instruments, the drummer's doing whatever, you know, everyone's trying to like, you know, the stomp box is ready, and then it's like you start it in, but it was also part of the performance, right? Like there was never a moment of not, you know, it wasn't not performance, and then, you know, we're like, and now Zach. I thought that was really exciting because it just made me think about, we talked about that room being the interior of the box that Henry Brown was in, and it was interesting for you to think about, he had to measure it out very specifically. Henry Brown had to measure out that box very specifically for him to survive in it and it to be transported, and you just measuring out that space in a way that to do the work you wanted to do. It was a really beautiful moment, so I just wanted to just say that.
I mean, I feel like I can't do, like everything that I did today is directly a result of all the conversations, the images, I mean, our working experiences through the Drawing Center to now and beyond, or before rather. But it is those, I mean, so I'm a listener. I listen to everything and I look at everything. And it's part of my practices to slowing down information and being attentive to it. And so as we're talking, in your little things that you don't think that's part of your score, but it's like, as you say, it was on a sidebar. I'm like, oh, that, you know, this. Also, Takwase, you know, as we walk from, you know, we're outside walking around and we're still having this conversation, we're engaging. You know, it may not be like, we may not be having these deep conversations about the work that we're doing, but we're still having a conversation and a dialogue. And it's those things that I pay attention to a lot.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's a great time to wrap up. Thank you all so much.
You all did good.
Oh man,
It's been a
great
long
setup.
day for you guys.
oh man, I'm about to.